of the things that's also evil is racism. White folks in America love talking about the military and how we love our military, but the reality is African Americans have always had to deal with two things: loving America on one hand and dealing with racism on the other. During World War I and World War II, they had what was called the Double V campaign: victory at home and victory abroad. And what they were fighting for ending fascism and ending racism. Well, guess what? This might be 2021, but black soldiers are still dealing with racism in America's military. The Associated Press put together a significant investigative report specifically dealing with this issue. And joining us right now is Kat Stafford. She is the National Investigative Race Writer for the Associated Press, and Richard Brookshire, co-founder and executive director of the Black Veterans Project. Glad to have both of you here on Roland Martin Unfiltered. Kat Stafford, talk with us about this project. How did it start? How long did it take to put it together? And what really jumped out at you when y'all were able to finish doing your reporting and put this all together and publish it?
Yes, well, first of all, Roland, thank you so much for having me on to talk about a really important topic that, frankly, I think we don't talk about enough in America, which is, of course, as you just stated, racism in the military. And this project was actually an offshoot of the January 6th Capitol insurrection. And, after what occurred, it started to come out that there were veterans that were involved with this insurrection, right? And so, like many media outlets, we started to kind of grapple with how much does extremism impact the military? But an important point that I want to make is you cannot talk about extremism in the military without talking about racism in the military, because the two are interlinked. And so what we found was that despite repeated pledges over the decades, really, this has been a long issue. This is nothing new. But despite these repeated pledges, the military has yet to really deal with racism in the military in a substantial way. We had really heartbreaking interviews with current enlistees, all the way up to officer ranks, right, as well as veterans, who kind of detailed how this is a generational issue. And some of our main findings were that the military's judicial system does not have an explicit category for hate crimes, which makes it difficult for them, right, to really figure out how big of an issue is prejudice in the military. We also found that the Defense Department does not have a real way to track how many troops have been ousted for having extremist views. So these are really concerning things that we have seen a lot of organizations really pleading with the Department of Defense to address. Now, we did get a response from the Department of Defense, and they said this is something that they are working on. They pointed to several measures, such as increasing implicit bias training. But again, from the folks that we talked to who are on the ground, they said this isn't just the issue of us feeling uncomfortable. We had service members who were telling us just horrific stories of being called racial slurs, being passed over for promotions. And the key thing here is, yes, racism exists in all of America. So, of course, it may exist in the military. But when you're talking about folks who are in life or death situations, there's an added layer of danger that comes with this, right? And so people are really pushing and hoping that with now Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin coming in, that he will really impart some systemic change. But again, this is change that needs to take place across the board on every single base.
Richard, I love when white folks think somebody black gets in a position that racism just all of a sudden goes away. We have our first black Pentagon secretary, retired four-star General Lloyd Austin. Of course, we've had other black generals as well. And the point that we keep making is just because one black person gets a high position doesn't mean that racism all of a sudden has evaporated. The military and in this investigation, they talked about people who are on present day duty of what they're dealing with, the kind of racism in all branches of the U.S. military.
Yeah. Well, first, thanks for having me. We started our project about 3 years ago because we saw that there was a lack of real digital conversation about how racism pervades the military, but also how it's tied to the present day manifestations of disparities that we see around veterans. And one thing I like to say when it comes to Secretary Austin, though I believe his appointment is important, we've had a black commander in chief, right? And so these things remain pervasive.
Questions from my panelists. I want to start with you, Mustafa. Your question for Richard and Kat.
So what type of additional training do you think that those who are in leadership need to be able to make real change happen? And the other part of that is what type of accountability needs to be tied to that training, so once someone is trained, then they're held accountable if they don't live up to that?
I'll jump in there. The military has the policies in place. They've had the policies in place for quite some time. They don't want to carry out those policies because of what the implications might be. Because racism exists not only from the bottom in the enlisted corps, but all the way up to the top brass of the military. And so when you start to have a conversation about race and their focus on extremism, I believe is a misnomer, right? Extremism, how do you even qualify that? Somebody has to become a neo-Nazi and go commit a hate crime. We know that, the creation of hostile work environments, the kind of passive things that were being spoken about, and overt things that were being spoken about earlier are quite rampant, and they have generational effects, especially when you become a veteran. When you talk about the military justice system, the same kind of racial disparities that we see in our civilian courts replicate themselves, except they have even more, in some respects, economic implications. And so the military actually has to have the courage to abide by its own policies and procedures and root out racists, right? And so when you think about the witch hunt that was Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and how effectively careers were ended under that policy, certainly, applying these policies around racism could be executed. But the implications are there are going to be so many people on so many different levels who frankly are going to be at risk of being kicked out, right? And so there's also this conversation about the infiltration of white nationalists in the military. Also a misnomer. They've always been there. The military has been white man's land, right? This kind of institution that was beyond reproach, right? Self-governing in many ways. And one of the things that we at the Black Veterans Project are really looking at are what are the real systemic shifts that need to happen, apart from just the policies of the DOD, who are really a self-governing apparatus. We're looking at the fact that no civil rights protections exist at the federal level that apply to the military. The military is its own self-governing apparatus. So what we're trying to think through, and we're working hand in hand with some congressional leaders on, is something called the Military Civil Rights Act. And how that holds the military accountable is that it would have to abide by the same civilian protocols under equal opportunity and the same enforcement measures, right? So in this article in AP, it talked about 750 complaints of racial discrimination in the year 2020 alone. We have 1.5 million service members. Those numbers don't add up, right? Because they know that there's fears of retribution. There are wide-reaching implications if you do make complaints. And even one of the things that we were able to do last year, we were really pushing for the release of racial bias survey data that the DOD collects every 2 years. And our advocacy, along with the report by Reuters, were able to force the DOD's hand to release just one single year of that data. And it was damning, right? It said 1 in 4 service members had witnessed white nationalism in the military. 1 in 4, also a misnomer. 350,000 military personnel had witnessed in that year alone white nationalism being espoused. And so when you have DOD leadership saying that extremism isn't pervasive, it's a misnomer. And I like to make that very, very clear.
Hey, Roland, if I could just jump in.
Teresa,
really
yeah, Kat, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a quick point. During the course of several interviews that we did, we had veterans and others who said, and experts as well, who made this point that, you could have all of the policies in the world put in place, right? We are seeing movement. Earlier this year, they passed the new National Defense Authorization Act with some sweeping changes, right? That would add, for instance, an inspector general who would be tasked with focusing on diversity and inclusion efforts, as well as weeding out extremists extremism. But again, if you don't have the right people in place on the ground on these bases where a lot of these issues are happening, what real impact will it have? And that is something that we are still seeing service members ask. You know, they're saying it's great, it's encouraging to see now Secretary Austin at the helm of the Department of Defense. But again, you know, it's a lot of separation from the top and what's happening on the ground. And I do want to make one note that while Black folks are, you know, represented well in the rank and file in terms of who you're seeing serve in the military, as you start to rise up those ranks, looking at officers, looking at generals, it is overwhelmingly white. And that is also part of the issue.
I'll jump in there one more time. So
Teresa,
one of our main research projects in the next year or two is to look at how military recruitment works writ large. Our new director of policy and research, while at Columbia, did a study of just the city of San Diego, looking at recruitment centers, and did some geospatial mapping, and was able to prove that there were recruitment centers strictly for enlisted in these kind of more impoverished Black neighborhoods, and the officer recruitment centers were in affluent white neighborhoods. So this is a system that the military deliberately has put in place.
Teresa, your question.
Yes. Well, one, thank you both. I think that is a full wealth of knowledge. I have a few family members who are currently in the military and those who have enlisted. So one of my questions is, if we are looking at the recruitment process a little bit more intensively, because as you know, some of these recruitment officers are showing up at, you know, colleges and practically high schools at this point. Some of the measures I think that you're putting out, is that also going to help in that sort of dialogue with, you know, some of the civil rights pieces?
Yeah, I mean, so a recent report that took about 3 years to actually come together was looking at the nominations processes for the more elite military schools like West Point, like the Naval Academy. And what they saw was something that we all know to be true. There was a dearth, right? And so when you look at military top brass, many of them have come through these schools. And so making sure that African-American communities are abreast of the opportunities, know about the different ways they can potentially, get into the officer corps. You have an overrepresentation of Black folk who have bachelor's degrees, which is the minimum bar to become an officer, that sign up as enlisted because they have bad recruiters, frankly, and they don't know the information. And so there needs to be efforts, and part of our project's work will be in combination with other organizations to do a public education drive, essentially, so that younger people who want to join the military are equipped with the knowledge that they need, so that this disparity, this really stark disparity, around 8% of the officer corps is made up of Black folk when they're 16% or around 16% of the U.S. population, that needs to be addressed. And it's not that it can't be addressed, there's an unwillingness to address it.
And if I could jump in and make another point, you know, one of the lead folks that we interviewed in this story, this was a woman who literally rose through the ranks of the Air Force, reaching the height of becoming a lieutenant colonel, right? This is a woman who has multiple medical degrees. She's a doctor. And even though she reached this height, she still faced so much racism. She told me stories about how she had white subordinates who refused to salute her, which is something that is a major issue in the military. She talked about how she was called racial slurs while she was trying to help patients in the Air Force. So again, you know, it's one thing to recruit these folks to help make sure that they are rising through the ranks. But again, even though they are reaching the highest of heights within the military, they are still faced with racism.
Ben, your question.
Yeah, I wonder to what extent either one of you could speak to the reality that much like America is built off of, it's a racist, white supremacist system. Therefore, its military is going to be the same. Dr. King saying that he feared that he assimilated us into a burning house. Is representation in the military in these ranks going to actually be achievable when we're literally fighting against the white supremacist core and the tools of white supremacy, the weapon of imperialism that's built on these ideas and these ideologies, literally built on the blood of Black people and Native people? But can we actually get that change from within? If you could just speak to that.
I think you have to work from outside and within. I mean, I'm a vet. I served for 7 years, deployed to Afghanistan, and I'm very much on the outside now, wanting to hold the military accountable. And I agree with all the points that you made. And I think it's something that double consciousness that Du Bois speaks of. Sometimes there's a triple consciousness when you actually have to serve the country. And you have to understand that most of the motivating factors that Black people even have to join are education, healthcare, housing, these things that all Americans are fighting for. And so when you think about even wanting to curb the kind of participation in this apparatus, we have to address that as a country. So the motivations are different for those who want to serve. I also think it's very important that Black folk are represented in this institution, because by default, if we're not, we're going to allow this critical American institution that will not be going anywhere to be ravaged by white supremacists. And I don't want to see the world in that way. But when I talk about even the Military Civil Rights Act, one of the big things that we have to really think about is the ways in which the coffers of the military are protected, right? And so when you go through the equal opportunity mechanism, say if you are aggrieved around racial lines, you don't really have redress. Someone might get demoted, perhaps, get kicked out of the military, but there's no financial recompense. And so there's something called Faris Doctrine that's been in place right after Eisenhower said that we were on the cusp of a military-industrial complex, because we very much have a war economy in this country that we've not wanted to confront. And so Faris bars people who serve in the military from being able to levy suit against the military. That's a baseline worker protection. And so for us at the Black Veterans Project, in combination with a lot of other organizations as well, we're thinking about how can we systematically shift this military that is shifting, like technology is shifting what the military looks like. You have less than 1% of the American population that's serving, but it's taking 50% of all discretionary money that we have at our disposal. And so what are the implications there? And so I think that Americans have to start to pay attention to the ways in which the military is raping the American public so that they don't have education, housing, healthcare. So I fully agree with you, and it has to be a multifaceted approach.
All right, then, folks. I appreciate it, Kat. For folks who haven't seen it, where can they go to read this investigative report?
You can go to apnews.com to see our latest report. You could just Google racism in the military. The great thing about the AP is our stories go everywhere.
All right, then. Richard, Kat, we appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Thanks. Thank you.
Folks, back to our Roland Martin Unfiltered video in just one moment.
It's time to be smart. When we control our institutions, we win. This is the most important news show on television of any racial background. Y'all put $2, $3, $4, $5, $10, $15, $20, $30 on this and keep this going. What you've done, Roland, since this crisis came out in full bloom. Anybody watching this, tell your friends. Go back and look at the last 2 weeks, especially of Roland Martin Unfiltered. I mean, hell, go back and look at the last 2 days. You've had sitting United States senators today, Klobuchar and Harris. Whatever you have, you can bring to Roland Martin Unfiltered to support it. Please do, because this information may literally save your life.
Watch Roland Martin Unfiltered daily at 6 p.m. Eastern on YouTube, Facebook, or Periscope, or go to RolandMartinUnfiltered.com. Support the Roland Martin Unfiltered Daily Digital Show by going to RolandMartinUnfiltered.com. Our goal is to get 20,000 of our fans contributing $50 each for the whole year. You can make this possible. RolandMartinUnfiltered.com.